My mother, God bless her soul, once said to me with that gentle smile of hers, over steaming cups of morning coffee, "Honey, not everyone is destined to shine like a star, and that's perfectly okay." I was 19, fresh out of the academy, my uniform still feeling stiff and new with the weight of my commission. I don't think she meant to hurt me, not really, but those words landed like a quiet blow, a subtle crack in my foundation. They became the unspoken soundtrack of every holiday, every visit home. I could hear them in the way my parents' eyes lingered on my sister, Sarah, the golden child, the one who always exceeded expectations. They never said I was a disappointment outright, but the silence was a deafening roar. When Sarah got her promotion at the hospital, their social media exploded with pride, each post a testament to her brilliance. When I returned from my first deployment overseas, there was no celebratory welcome at the airport. "You know how busy we are, Emily," my dad said, his tone casual, as if I'd simply missed a routine appointment, not spent 7 grueling months running covert ops in places most people couldn't even find on a map. At Thanksgiving dinner that year, they gave my usual seat to a neighbor's son who'd just gotten into law school. "It's a big deal, Emily," they'd explained, and I ended up eating standing by the kitchen sink, my commendations for meritorious service still packed away in a dusty box in the garage. That night, I made a silent vow. No more chasing their elusive approval. I'd face down enemy fire. I didn't need to keep fighting for a place in my own family's eyes. Then, just last month, I was observing a command briefing, sitting quietly in the back, another face in a room buzzing with ranks and titles that never quite felt like they belonged to me. The air crackled with anticipation. Suddenly, the door swung open and a high-ranking officer strode in, his gaze sweeping across the room before locking onto me. He stood a little straighter, squared his shoulders, and announced, his voice resonating with authority, "Ma'am, you're the general." The room fell into a stunned silence, a silence that wasn't for Sarah this time, wasn't for anyone but me. That moment wasn't sweet, it was sharp, the culmination of years spent in the shadows finally breaking open in a single breath. And for the first time, I wasn't ashamed to take up space. "My name is Emily Carter, and I've led brave men and women into harm's way, held the hands of dying soldiers on foreign soil, made decisions that still haunt my sleepless nights. But the hardest battle I ever fought was the one for visibility in my own home." Before I delve deeper into my story, I need to know you're with me. Please just type "listening" in the comments or let me know where you're reading from. It truly means more than you can imagine. Sometimes just knowing someone is out there makes it easier to speak your truth aloud. And if my story resonates with you, if it makes you feel a little less alone, please consider subscribing. It helps these truths find their way to more hearts. Thank you. Now let me tell you everything. My name is Emily Carter, and I was the eldest daughter in a family steeped in tradition, 3 generations of military service, discipline ingrained in our bones, and unspoken expectations hanging heavy in the air. We practically grew up on base protocol at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The military wasn't just a career, it was our family's very essence. My father, Robert Carter, retired as a decorated brigadier general in the Army. My mother, Susan, served as a dedicated nurse in a combat support hospital, her quiet strength another form of unspoken commendation. My younger brother, Michael, is now a lieutenant colonel, and Sarah, my seemingly perfect younger sister, is on track to pin on the stars of a brigadier general herself in the National Guard. And then there's me, the one they rarely mentioned outside the immediate family circle. In their eyes, I was the one who couldn't hack it, the one who walked away from West Point after just 1 grueling year. They said I lacked the discipline, the inherent drive, that I simply didn't have what it took. But none of them knew the truth. I didn't leave. I was specifically recruited, handpicked for a clandestine intelligence program so deeply buried in the shadows that it didn't officially exist. There was no graduation ceremony, no proud family photos and frames on the wall, just a series of one-way tickets to places no tourist would ever dream of venturing. For the past 20 years, I haven't been absent from their lives. I've simply been erased, operating in a world they couldn't comprehend. I sent anonymous birthday flowers to Mom, a generic Christmas card to Dad with a return address that traced back to a mail drop in Virginia. I watched from afar as Sarah's star ascended, as Michael married his college sweetheart in a base chapel, as their lives unfolded in neat, public chapters documented in family newsletters and holiday cards. I was never in the picture, quite literally. A distant cousin once mentioned a recent family portrait where I'd been neatly cropped out to maintain the balance of the composition. They likely still believed I'd quit because I wasn't tough enough. What they didn't know, what I couldn't tell them, was that I spent 6 harrowing months embedded in a hostile network in Baghdad, that I spent 5 agonizing days concealed within the crumbling walls of a terrorist training camp in the Pakistani mountains, coordinating a drone strike that neutralized a major threat. That in the operation codenamed Silent Watch, we prevented a catastrophic attack on American soil, but I lost 2 brave colleagues and a part of my soul remained in that desolate landscape. And still I came back, always for the next mission, but never truly home. You don't share those kinds of stories in my family unless they come adorned with medals and glowing press coverage. I had neither, just scars, most of them unseen, etched onto my spirit. Then came the call. It was late summer, a hint of autumn crisping the edges of the humid North Carolina air. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, but I knew instantly it was my mother. Her voice was efficient, not unkind, but devoid of warmth, like a doctor reciting test results rather than speaking to her own daughter. "Sarah's being promoted again," she stated, matter-of-factly. "We expect you to be there. And Emily, please wear something appropriate. Don't make her look bad. This is important." There was no, "How are you?" "No, we'd love to see you," just the familiar undercurrent of, "Don't embarrass us." I didn't argue. "I'll be there," I replied simply. Not because I anticipated a heartfelt welcome, not because I imagined they'd suddenly see the woman I had become. I was going back for one reason, to see if, just once, they could truly look at me and see the person behind the carefully constructed shadow, to see if, under the right light, they might finally realize they had misjudged me all these years. That night, I stood before my closet, my gaze drawn to the back where my old dress uniform hung, crisp, untouched, folded with a precision that spoke of a ceremony that never materialized. I carefully placed it in my suitcase. Beside it, I laid out a simple, neutral blouse and a pair of unassuming slacks, clothes that wouldn't attract attention, that wouldn't silently scream for validation, just quiet fabric in quiet tones. The face that stared back at me from the mirror was etched with the lines of countless sleepless nights, the sharp gaze that had seen too much. It was a face no longer young, but not old either, just settled. No rank visible, no applause echoing in the silence, and surprisingly, almost no resentment. Almost time, I whispered to my reflection, the words hanging in the air. I wasn't sure if I meant time to forgive them, or time to finally let the silence speak its own undeniable truth. I arrived at Fort Bragg precisely on schedule. There was no warm greeting, no one waiting out front, not even a cursory nod from the MP at the gate. The designated VIP parking area was already overflowing with gleaming SUVs and government-issue sedans. I parked near the logistics unit's fence, the crunch of gravel under my worn boots a familiar sound, as if the very ground remembered who I was, even if my own family seemed to have forgotten. The house hadn't changed much in 2 decades. The same faded yellow paint, the same slightly lopsided porch swing, the same American flag waving with almost aggressive ceremonial pride. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar scent of lemon-scented cleaner and my mother's well-loved paperbacks. She stood in the dining room, meticulously arranging printed name cards along the polished mahogany table. Without looking up, she said, her tone clipped, "Go change your shirt, Emily. You and Sarah will be sitting next to each other, but please, for heaven's sake, don't interrupt her speech tomorrow." Not a hello, not a hug, not even a passing comment on the 10-hour drive I just completed to be there. Just instructions, the familiar language of our household. My father greeted me with the same formality he reserved for officers he barely knew, a quick, firm pat on the back, a nod of distant recognition, something akin to respect but utterly devoid of warmth. "Good, you made it," he stated, his eyes already sliding past me to the doorway behind. Sarah made her grand entrance then, radiating confidence in her perfectly tailored dress blues, her ribbons and medals gleaming as if she alone had won some silent war. She glided across the room, exchanging practice smiles and air kisses, charming the small gathering of family and close friends. When she finally acknowledged my presence, she gestured vaguely in my direction with a perfectly manicured hand. "This is my sister, Emily," she announced, her tone dismissive. "She used to be in the military for a little while. Now she works in administration, I think." A ripple of polite, almost pitying laughter followed, the kind that cuts deep because no one intends it to be cruel. A cousin leaned in, her voice a half-whisper, "So what exactly do you do now, Emily? VA office work? Better than nothing, right?" Better than nothing. I offered a tight smile, not quite reaching my eyes. I said nothing. There's a certain dignity in silence, especially when your truth is shrouded in classifications. Inside the house, every wall was a shrine to Sarah and Michael's achievements. Framed photographs of them in uniform, graduation portraits, retirement ceremonies I hadn't attended, award dinners where their smiles shone brightly. I scanned each carefully arranged frame. Not a single one held my face. The last photo I was in dated back to 2004, just after my ill-fated year at West Point. I remembered it vividly because I had been painstakingly cropped out later. To balance the new frame, they'd explain casually. A little niece, maybe 6 or 7 years old, tugged tentatively on my hand. "Did you ever shoot a real gun?" she asked, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. I crouched down to her level and smiled gently. "Sweetheart, I once wrote a plan that helped 30 brave soldiers come home alive. That's better than any shot I've ever taken." She blinked, absorbing my words, then ran off to play with a plastic army tank. Dinner was a small, intimate pre-ceremony gathering, just the immediate family and a handful of senior officers who were close to my father. Sarah played the perfect hostess, exuding grace and calculated charm. At one point, someone complimented her on her poise. She beamed, accepting the praise with practiced humility. "I've been practicing my speech," she confided, taking a delicate sip of her wine. Then, with a casualness that felt deliberately pointed, she added, "I want people to know that you don't have to walk away from something to realize you were wrong." The air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. I didn't utter a single word. I didn't need to. The thinly veiled message hung in the air, heavy with implication, and it had my name all over it. Later that night, I slipped out onto the porch, seeking a moment of solitude. The house hummed with the murmur of conversations and forced laughter behind me, but I wanted none of it. In the distance, the military band was rehearsing, the disjointed notes carrying through the cool night air like ghostly melodies. I sat on the edge of the porch steps, watching the wind rustle the leaves in the ancient oak tree in the front yard. Tomorrow, I would sit quietly, allowing Sarah her moment in the spotlight. But truth, I knew, possessed a voice all its own, and when it finally chose to speak, no one, not even Sarah, would be able to talk over it. The main hall at Fort Bragg resembled a cathedral of command, the high ceilings and polished brass light fixtures casting golden halos over the rigid rows of folding chairs. Everything was arranged with military precision, by rank and title, like a silent battlefield awaiting orders. I found my assigned seat in the third row from the back, awkwardly wedged between a junior officer's nervous fiancé and someone's overly perfumed aunt. Our row was simply labeled family, unassigned, a bureaucratic way of saying you're here, but not really part of the formation. Sarah stood tall and poised behind the podium at the front, the American flag a silent sentinel to her left, her polished boots gleaming to her right. She had that familiar glint in her eyes, controlled ambition, the kind you learn to cultivate during endless war games and promotion board interviews. She spoke eloquently of loyalty, perseverance, and my personal favorite, the crucial importance of distancing oneself from those who had once abandoned the sacred trust of the uniform. Every word was carefully chosen, every glance strategically choreographed. The speech wasn't just for her superiors, it was a calculated performance aimed at the ghosts in the room, and one ghost in particular. When my name was mentioned, almost as an afterthought, as a family member in attendance, I noticed a ripple of subtle movement in the audience. A few heads turned, a couple of officers exchanged hushed comments. One leaned towards another and whispered, his brow furrowed in thought, "She looks familiar. Where have I seen her before?" I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, my posture neutral, my face an unreadable mask. That's when he entered. General David Hammond. He walked in with a quiet gravitas, the kind that makes an entire room subtly straighten its collective spine before it even consciously registers his presence. He scanned the audience briefly, his eyes sharp and assessing, before locking onto mine. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a brisk, direct march toward my seat. My heart didn't pound, my palms didn't sweat, but the very air around me seemed to shift, like the sudden stillness before a storm. General Hammond came to a precise halt beside me, his heels clicking together with practiced military precision. He raised his hand in a textbook salute, sharp, proud, and utterly public. "Ma'am," he stated, his voice steady and carrying clearly through the silent hall, "General Carter, it's an honor to see you again." The room didn't just quiet, it froze. Sarah's voice cracked mid-sentence, her hand clutching her note cards trembling visibly. The polite applause that had punctuated her earlier remarks vanished into the stunned silence. She was no longer the center of gravity in the room. I rose to return the salute, not because I craved validation, but because I refused to allow a man who had once entrusted me with countless lives to stand alone in a gesture of respect. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother's water glass slip from her grasp, the sharp sound of it shattering on the polished floor echoing like a gunshot. My father started to rise from his seat in reflex, then slowly sank back down, as if attempting to disappear into the very upholstery. A young officer behind me leaned towards his neighbor and whispered, not nearly as quietly as he intended, "Is that her? The ghost commander from Dagger." Sarah visibly struggled to regain her composure. She attempted to continue her speech, her voice brittle, her eyes frantically scanning the room for an anchor, but the energy had irrevocably shifted. Eyes no longer hung on her every carefully crafted word. They were either fixed on me or, even more unsettlingly, darting between what they thought they knew and the dawning realization of how much they didn't. The ceremony concluded with polite, almost perfunctory applause, but the tension lingered in the air like the acrid smell of smoke after a controlled burn. As the guests began to file out, the officers mingling in hushed tones, Sarah cornered me near the exit, her face tight with barely suppressed fury. No congratulations, no semblance of a smile. "Why didn't you say something?" she hissed under her breath, her eyes blazing. "You let me stand up there like a fool. Was that your plan all along?" I looked at her, not unkindly, but with a quiet steadiness that offered no ground. "If you need the truth to shrink for you to feel tall, you never stood tall to begin with." Her mouth tightened, and she blinked rapidly, twice, as if fighting back tears or perhaps just the raw sting of unexpected exposure. I walked past her before she could formulate a response, the measured click of my heels against the polished floor the only sound accompanying my departure. This time, as I walked away, I didn't feel the familiar sting of unseen eyes mocking my retreating back. Instead, I felt the heavy weight of confusion I was leaving behind, an entire room suddenly unsure of the roles they had been assigned to play, the comfortable narrative they had so readily accepted, now realizing the cast list might have been wrong all along. After the ceremony, I didn't return to my family's house. I drove directly back to the base and let myself into the quiet, nondescript guest quarters they had so casually assigned me. Standard military-issue beige walls, a stiff, impersonal bedspread, and a lamp that emitted a faint hum when illuminated. It was the kind of room designed to host people briefly and forget them quickly. I dropped my car keys onto the worn dresser, kicked off my shoes, and noticed something that felt profoundly out of place. A plain manila envelope lay squarely in the center of the otherwise empty desk. No name, no seal, no discernible handwriting, just sitting there, as if it had been patiently waiting for me. I picked it up, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach, and carefully opened the flap. Inside was a printed scan of an email, the timestamp indicating it had been sent 2 years prior. There was no sender listed, just a message forwarded from an encrypted relay server, adding to the sense of the clandestine. The subject line was stark and accusatory: reckless operation, civilian casualties. The body of the email contained serious allegations against a Colleen W., accusing her of commanding an unsanctioned mission that had resulted in multiple civilian deaths. The message ominously claimed that the damning details were deliberately buried within heavily redacted reports and urged a fringe military blog known for its sensationalism to expose the rot within the ranks. Reading what amounted to your own professionally drafted death sentence, penned by an unknown hand, was a bizarre and chilling sensation. But the specific wording of the email stopped me cold. I recognized it instantly, not just the vaguely referenced operation, but the precise phrasing, almost word for word, lifted directly from a highly classified after-action report I had personally reviewed in a steel-lined bunker in Stuttgart years ago. That particular report had only been seen by 3 individuals: myself, the lead intelligence analyst on the mission, and a junior officer with limited, peripheral clearance, Sarah. The dates align with the period when I had inexplicably been flagged for a brief internal inquiry. At the time, I was informed it was simply an automated red flag triggered by an anomaly in operational data. Routine procedure, nothing to be concerned about. The inquiry had been quietly dismissed within days, and I had accepted their explanation without further question. But someone had clearly made certain that the smoke lingered long after the supposed fire had been extinguished. I carefully placed the envelope in my briefcase. I didn't bother changing out of my uniform. My mind was already racing, piecing together the fragmented clues. I found Sarah at the post-ceremony reception, still resplendent in her dress blues, surrounded by a small throng of well-wishers basking in the warm glow of her perceived achievement. I waited patiently on the periphery until the crowd thinned, then approached her just as she stepped outside onto a small balcony, her phone pressed to her ear. I held up the printed email scan. She glanced at it, her eyes flicking across the page as if seeing a ghost, a flicker of something: recognition? Guilt? Momentarily betraying her carefully constructed composure. "Did you send this?" I asked, my voice even, devoid of accusation, simply seeking the truth. She stared at me for a long, unnerving moment, her gaze unwavering, and then, without blinking, she said, "Yes." I nodded slowly, absorbing the confirmation, a cold wave of understanding washing over me. Why? Her carefully maintained facade finally crumbled, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly, like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly severed. Because you weren't supposed to win, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, laced with a bitterness I hadn't fully grasped before. You left. You didn't stay and build something here. You don't get to just waltz back in and still be more important. I didn't move, didn't speak, allowing her raw resentment to hang in the cool night air. She pressed on, her voice cracking with a mixture of pain and lingering jealousy. They never stopped talking about you, Emily. Even when you were gone. Even when I did everything right, it was always about what you were doing, what you had accomplished. A heavy silence descended between us, thicker and more suffocating than any outright accusation I could have leveled. In that moment, I saw not the ambitious officer but the wounded child, the little sister who had once trailed after me, desperately seeking inclusion, yearning to feel special in a household where achievement was the only true currency. You do realize, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm, the weight of the revelation settling heavily upon me, that leaking classified information is a criminal offense. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of fear replacing the simmering resentment, before narrowing again. She said nothing, the silence between us charged with unspoken consequences. I didn't press further. I simply turned and walked away, the cool night air hitting my face like a cleansing wave. I clutched the damning envelope tightly in my hand, my fingers trembling, not from rage, but from the deep, quiet ache of understanding. Sometimes the blade that finds its way into your back comes from the very hand that once helped you learn to walk. It was the jarring blare of the base-wide emergency alarm that ripped me from a fitful sleep, not the familiar reveille bugle, but something far more urgent, piercing, designed not to gently rouse but to flood the system with adrenaline. My phone buzzed insistently a moment later, the screen flashing with a stark, emergency protocol active notification. All personnel with high-level security clearances were being immediately summoned to the Central Coordination Center. There was no time for questions, years of ingrained training took over. I was dressed and out the door within minutes. The usually orderly corridors of Fort Bragg were a chaotic flurry of movement, officers in varying states of alert, some still struggling into their boots, others already hunched over flickering monitors in the dimly lit hallways. At the entrance to the main operations room, a grim-faced sergeant handed me a thin but ominously heavy file. A breach! A highly classified dossier connected to Operation Silent Watch, the very mission I had led in the shadowy corners of Pakistan, had just been uploaded to a secure, encrypted forum on the dark web. The leak was recent, the timestamp within the last 3 hours. And even more disturbingly, the forensic trace, however preliminary, pointed back to an internal IP address, specifically an inactive device that had once been assigned to me, still inexplicably embedded within the base system. It felt like waking up in a nightmare, a life you had no recollection of signing up for. Within half an hour, I found myself seated across a cold, sterile conference table from General Hammond and 2 stone-faced officials from Military Intelligence Command. The room felt colder than the ambient temperature suggested. They didn't explicitly state I was under arrest, but the unspoken suspicion hung heavy in the air. They requested full access to all my communications records from the past 6 months. I didn't argue, I provided them with everything. Yet, a nagging unease persisted. My mind kept circling back to the anonymous email, the one Sarah had sent, the printed scan that had so mysteriously appeared on my desk. In the initial shock of its discovery, I hadn't delved into the technical details. But now, with the full resources of the agency at my disposal, I retrieved the email's metadata and painstakingly decrypted the sending path. What I uncovered was startling. The anonymous sender had utilized an outdated link to an auto-backup server that had once archived mission logs, a server that had long been decommissioned, or so everyone believed. The link they had carelessly used inadvertently triggered a dormant process, one that unintentionally retrieved and attached a hidden file containing top-level intelligence, the very file that had now surfaced online. A careless mistake on their part, perhaps, but not a random one. When I traced the originating device of the email, the digital footprint pointed to a machine that had been logged into just 2 days prior using an active credential, Sarah's. According to base records, she had checked in late that evening for pre-deployment training preparation. I remembered then, a seemingly insignificant detail, how she had casually mentioned leaving her laptop at the comm station overnight, unlocked and unattended. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Now her compromised access was a crucial part of the unfolding forensic trail. I stared at the glowing screen, the implications sinking in like stones in water. My sister, the little girl who had once sobbed when I left for West Point, the woman who now, perhaps out of desperation or misguided ambition, was systematically unraveling herself, thread by thread. Before I could fully process the weight of this new revelation, a sharp knock at the door of my temporary quarters shattered the storm brewing inside my head. It was my father. He looked older than I remembered, the familiar sternness in his eyes softened by a palpable weariness, a flicker of something that resembled vulnerability. We hadn't spoken privately in years. He didn't offer a greeting, just stood at the threshold, his gaze direct, and asked quietly, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air, "Is it true, Emily? Did you leak it?" I met his gaze, searching for anger but finding only a deep-seated fear. Fear for me, for the family name, perhaps for everything he had ever believed in about honor, duty, and service. I didn't flinch. "I don't need you to believe me, Dad," I stated, my voice steady, resolute. "But I will prove the truth. Not for myself, but for the people who are still trusting this system with their very lives." He nodded once, a slow, almost imperceptible movement, said nothing further, and turned to walk away, the unspoken disappointment a tangible presence in the small room. The next morning I made a formal request to General Hammond, permission to lead the internal investigation into the security breach. It was an unorthodox proposal, a breach of protocol, but technically I was still on classified reserve duty and possessed the necessary security clearances to operate. More importantly, I had a unique and compelling motive that no one else could claim, to expose the truth without destroying the very institution that had both shaped and nearly buried me. General Hammond listened intently, his gaze unwavering, without a single interruption. When I finished outlining my rationale, he stood slowly, walked around the imposing briefing table, and extended his hand. "General Carter," he said, his eyes steady and conveying a newfound respect, "the floor is yours." The Strategic Command briefing room hummed with an almost palpable tension. The silence was so profound that the low thrum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like static in my ears. I sat at the head of the polished table, the very seat I had once been denied access to based on rank, now occupied out of necessity. Across from me sat the representatives from the Military Investigation Bureau and Base Security Command, their faces impassive, their notebooks open but untouched, a silent testament to the gravity of the situation. I laid out my hypothesis calmly, methodically. The security breach, I argued, wasn't an act of deliberate sabotage, but rather a catastrophic cascade of errors, a sequence of reckless decisions and misjudged steps that had begun with a seemingly innocuous anonymous email. One sent not with the intent to betray, but to provoke, and in doing so had unknowingly triggered a digital minefield. I presented the meticulously gathered metadata, the intricate system trails, and the digital breadcrumbs that clearly began with Sarah's compromised email account and ultimately led to the leaked classified file. They didn't dispute my logic, the evidence was too compelling. But General Hammond, with a knowing look, then did something unexpected, something that added another layer of complexity to the already tangled web. He appointed an internal task force to assist with the investigation, comprised not of impartial experts or outside consultants, but my own family. I was to lead the team as the primary analyst and field coordinator. My father, Colonel Robert Carter, would manage the campaign intelligence archives from past operations, leveraging his still active restricted access from his post-retirement advisory role. Sarah was tasked with tracing internal system vulnerabilities and potential access points, a role that ironically placed her at the heart of the very system she had unwittingly compromised. And my mother, with her extensive medical background as a combat nurse and a little-known specialty in biological trace evidence analysis, was assigned to assist with the forensic recovery efforts from the laptop Sarah had left behind in the tech bay. It felt like being thrust into a bizarre, high-stakes theatrical performance where every actor knew their lines, but no one truly wanted to share the stage. The inaugural task force meeting was glacial. My father initiated the briefing, his eyes glued to the projected data on the screen rather than making any direct contact with the individuals in the room. He spoke in clipped, almost detached tones, as if reading a somber obituary. Sarah presented her segment next. Short, efficient, sterile, her voice devoid of any inflection. She didn't look up once from her notes. Only my mother occasionally shifted her gaze between us, her expression a mixture of concern and a deep, almost mournful sadness, as if witnessing her children transform into people she no longer fully recognized. But I wasn't there seeking warmth or familial reconciliation. I was there for results. And then the first significant breakthrough emerged. While meticulously combing through an archival node directly linked to Sarah's recent server scans, Our sophisticated security AI flagged a dormant Trojan malware program embedded deep within a 2017 operations archive. The malware had never been activated, merely tucked away within the seemingly innocuous shell of a logistical support file. The date caught my attention immediately, 2017. That was the year I had a significant clash with Derek Glade, a fellow strategist during a joint task force operation in Mosul. He had advocated for an aggressive sweep through densely populated civilian zones to eliminate suspected hostile elements. I had vehemently opposed his plan, insisting on a phased containment strategy to minimize civilian casualties. My approach had ultimately been adopted, deemed the more ethical and strategically sound option, but it had earned me the silent resentment of Derek, who viewed my caution as a sign of bureaucratic weakness and a direct impediment to his more forceful methods. Derek wasn't just someone who held a grudge. He had, at one point, held temporary encryption override privileges for the very campaign servers that had been compromised. If he had planted the dormant malware back then, it could have remained undetected for years, silently waiting for an unsuspecting individual like Sarah to accidentally trigger its activation by accessing a specific, less trafficked pathway within the system. It was at that precise moment that my mother, without a word, quietly slid a familiar manila folder across the polished conference table towards me. It was the Candle Strike mission debrief, my debrief. "You left this behind when you shipped out after that operation, Emily," she said softly, her gaze meeting mine for the first time with a depth I hadn't seen in years. I read it back then. "I thought you were deliberately hiding your actions, perhaps burdened by the weight of command. Now I think you were simply trying to survive, quietly, under a burden none of us truly understood." I didn't reply. The weight of her words, the unspoken understanding in her eyes, was too profound for a casual response. Her words weren't an explicit apology, but they were something older, heavier, a recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the unseen battles I had fought. I offered her a small, almost imperceptible smile, not born of pride, but because something fundamental had subtly shifted within the complex dynamics of our family. Later that evening, our network security systems traced a login ping originating from a remote IP address. The attempt had been unsuccessful, a clumsy effort to scrub system logs directly tied to the initial security breach. The geographic location of the ping pinpointed a budget motel just outside the perimeter of Fort Bragg. Further investigation revealed a 3-day booking paid for entirely in cash. The name used on the reservation, Derek Glade. It became chillingly clear then that this was no longer solely about my sister's impulsive actions, or even the complex, often fractured dynamics of our family. There was a calculated actor in play, someone clever, patient, and ruthlessly willing to exploit our internal divisions as his own perfect camouflage, a man who had been lurking in the shadows, patiently waiting for the chaos we had inadvertently created to serve his own agenda. The raid on the decommissioned tech bunker felt like a storm front gathering strength, initially silent, a sense of foreboding hanging in the air, before erupting with electric tension and sharp, decisive action. Under emergency authorization, we surrounded the isolated facility with strategic precision. Derek had predictably returned to the one place he likely assumed no one was actively monitoring, the old data relay room from a long-forgotten division, still precariously wired into the secondary military network. He was halfway through uploading a compressed bundle of sensitive data when our team breached the reinforced steel door. He didn't resist, didn't even flinch at our sudden and forceful entry. He simply looked up at me, a grim, almost resigned expression on his face, and said, his voice flat, "Took you long enough." In the subsequent interrogation, Derek laid out his motivations not with any sense of pride or remorse, but with a cold, almost clinical clarity. "I didn't want to take you down in some public spectacle," he stated, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "I just wanted you out of the room permanently. The intel leak was designed to paint you as a liability. Once your security clearance was stripped, no more NATO Council briefings, no more front-row seat at strategic planning talks. You rose too fast, Carter. People stopped questioning you." His voice was laced with a bitter resentment, the tone not manic, but that of a man who had clung to a festering grudge for so long that it had finally soured into a corrosive obsession. He had meticulously crafted a strategy to exploit the long-standing fissures within our family, banking on Sarah's impulsive misstep to ignite the rest of his carefully laid plans. It was then I fully realized that he hadn't truly broken us. He had merely observed our slow unraveling, then opportunistically planted his flag amidst the ensuing chaos. When Sarah was presented with the full transcript of Derek's confession, she sat utterly still, her face pale, the color drained from her lips. She stared at the printed words as if they possessed the power to magically rearrange themselves into something less devastating, less damning. After several long, silent minutes, she finally spoke, her gaze fixed on the damning document, not meeting my eyes. I didn't know what I did would lead to this. I simply folded my arms across my chest, the weight of her unintended consequences hanging heavy in the air. Sometimes, I said quietly, the analogy's stark, we set fire to a seemingly dry field, fueled by our own petty jealousies, and we conveniently forget that people actually sleep in that tall grass. Her carefully constructed composure finally fractured, her lower lip trembling slightly, but she fought to maintain control. That was Sarah. Pride always armored her guilt. The following day, during the meticulous compilation of our final investigative report, Sarah quietly submitted a handwritten addendum. In it, she took full responsibility for initiating the chain of emails that had ultimately enabled Derek's security breach. While the investigation concluded that there was no direct intent on her part to leak classified state secrets, she accepted a formal reprimand. A black mark on her otherwise spotless record that would effectively cost her eligibility for promotion for the next 5 years. She signed the document without being asked, her hand steady, her expression resolute. It didn't feel like a personal victory. The damage done was far more complex than simple wins and losses. At the concluding task force meeting, we sat across from each other once more around the familiar conference table, but this time, the atmosphere was palpably different. Sarah no longer actively avoided my gaze, and when our father stood up to deliver his closing remarks, he paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his 3 children before stating, his voice surprisingly steady, I owe an apology to this entire team, especially to Emily. I let medals and pride make me blind to what truly matters. It was the first time I had ever heard him openly admit fault, let alone in a room filled with ranking officers.